Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 423 of the Juicebox Podcast. On today's episode of Defining Diabetes, Jenny Smith and I are going to define insulin deficit. Today's episode is part of the Defining Diabetes series, which lives here inside of the Juicebox Podcast. It's where Jenny Smith and I take terms from your life with type 1 diabetes and explain them in ways that we hope make them useful and understandable. My friend Jenny Smith has had type 1 diabetes since she was a child, I think for over 31 years now. Jenny holds a bachelor's degree in human nutrition and biology from the University of Wisconsin. She is a registered and licensed dietitian, a certified diabetes educator, and a certified trainer on most makes and models of insulin pumps and continuous glucose monitoring systems. And she used to be one of Santa's elves. Please remember as you listen that nothing you hear on the Juicebox Podcast should be considered advice, medical or otherwise. Always consult a physician before making any changes to your healthcare plan or becoming bold with insulin. Now the music will build to a crescendo and we will begin. This is going to be probably a pretty simple one, and it might not take a lot of talking, but I do want to give it its own space. Define insulin deficit. How do you think of it if I say those words?
Well, I think it could be defined in a couple of different settings. And if insulin deficit is easy, you decide to eat whatever you're going to eat and you just don't take insulin for it. So there's a deficit of insulin, right? Clearly, right? There could also be an insulin deficit. And this one I think is harder to determine how much insulin you need to correct and right the situation of insulin loss is when you have someone using a pump and the pump site has failed, but you don't quite know that that's what's happened. You're like doing all these extra things. You're bolusing extra. You're trying to like fix the high blood sugar. And finally you realize, oh, my pump site is all wet, or I smell insulin, or, oh, look at that. My pump site was like kinked instead of, when I took it out. That's a harder deficit to repair because you're not quite sure how long has the deficit been going on? How much of the bolus 2 hours ago actually went in? Did any of it go in? My blood sugar is here. So that one's, I think, a little harder to take care of. But a deficit, you're missing insulin. Right. Why? It has to do with like figuring out where you didn't get insulin or what. What's the reason?
In the scenario when your pump site goes bad, I sort of just look back. Arden has the Dexcom, so it's easier. But I sort of look back at where I start seeing that drift up. And if I think to myself, well, that was 2 hours ago and she's 225 right now, I just act like none of that insulin that I thought I gave her exists. And I go pretty hard at it and just try to start over again. I am such a big fan of like crush it, stop it, start over again, because I think it's time saving.
Yeah.
And I don't like the idea of, I don't know. I know this is probably completely backwards from what most people get told, but if you have a 300 blood sugar and it takes you 6 hours to bring it down, I don't know. That just seems...
That's a long time of feeling like crud.
Yeah. It doesn't seem right to me. And I don't make a habit of dropping Arden's blood sugar like a stone. I'm not saying that. And I don't think that's good either. I'm just saying that if I see that drift up and it's been an hour, well, then I think, all right, an hour ago, she stopped having enough insulin. But the truth is, though, is that I have the comfort in my head to know that her insulin's being used correctly or it's been set up correctly so that at any sort of a drift up, I don't think of as an anomaly. I think of it as something went wrong in the process, but that's because I have the confidence to know that the process is going to go the way it's going to go. It's tougher for people who are still getting things right or chasing things around. That's a horror that I have trouble putting into words. Like, what does it feel like when something's happening inside of your body and you don't know what it is?
Correct.
And how do you make the next step? And I do see how people get to, well, I'll just wait.
Right. Right.
So
I think, that's a really valid point to bring up is if you're going to be, as you coined the wonderful term, if you're going to be bold with insulin, know how your body responds to it.
Yeah, you can't
and start
guess.
to learn that.
Right.
Because you have things for Arden so well set that you can say, she wouldn't be drifting like this. I know that there's something not right here. I can add this much more insulin. I can attack it. I can avoid being 300. And if you do it with the pump and the pump site, she just keeps going up. Well, you're going to change that out. You're going to stop it again before. And you might, like me, I usually just do an injection. I'm not going to wait around for a pump site to start absorbing. Well, I give an injection and I take care of it.
Yeah.
Because like you said, who wants to sit at 300 for 6 hours?
Right. You have some sort of a deficit. Fix the issue as you can, come in, inject a correction. I always do a temp basal increase too, to kind of get the site moving, and then you're on your way again. Yeah. I don't think we've experienced a site change high blood sugar in a very long time, because I don't even bat an eye now. Last night we changed Arden's pod and her blood sugar was 85, and I bolused a half a unit just because we changed the site and didn't think anything of it. But to dig in farther for insulin deficit, you can have a deficit at a meal, right? You could need 4 units, use 3 units. That'd be a deficit of your meal bolus. Mm-hmm. I see people whose basal rates are sometimes really steady. Their lines are steady, but they're higher. Oh, look how steady I am, but I'm always 140. That to me is a basal deficit. You don't have enough basal unless you meant for your blood sugar to be at 140.
Right.
And then even with corrections, like we talked about earlier with your ISF or your correction factor, you're too late there. But when you're missing in all of those places, these deficits have different impacts, right? So your basal a basal deficit keeps you raised higher. If you have a meal deficit, then you're going to shoot up after you eat. And if you have a correction deficit, you're going to stay up longer once you're up there. And all of those things are really just to say that you have to use the right amount of insulin at the right time. And if your blood sugar is high, you probably don't have enough insulin. But a lot of people have deficits. I don't know if this is the right place to talk about this or not, but in the last month or so, since I talked to you last, I've helped 2 people with control IQ, and I did it blindly. Meaning that I have never seen the settings on Control IQ. I don't know what the menu looks like. I have no idea. But I followed their Dexcom and I said, I'm going to talk to you in my words and we'll translate them to what you see there. And I was able to get 2 people's graphs level
Numbers
and lower.
Down.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it was I almost just did it for fun, which I think says something weird about me. I was like, I wonder if I could do this. And I started with the one, I said to the one, I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm like, I'm happy to be a sounding board for you, but just remember that everything I say is going to be a guess. I have no idea. But in the end, it didn't matter. It was all the same. You know what I mean? You need more insulin here, less insulin here. You don't pre-bolus, you have to pre-bolus. It was all the same stuff.
Right.
Over and over again.
I think something too, and you bring in good point about where did the deficit kind of start? And with your initial, if you're sitting nice and stable, but at a blood sugar 140 or even 150 or whatever, and you're flat and stable at it, what I always recommend to people is, was it flat and stable at a lower number and then you ate and then you got to the 140 or 150 and it never came down after that?
Yeah.
Because that's then not necessarily relative to the basal. That's the bolus problem. Right. So sometimes it takes you have to take a couple steps back to look at where does it look like the deficit kind of got going? Mm-hmm. Because somebody might think in the scenario of, it's 140, but it's flat and I'd rather it be at, 102 and flat. Yeah. I'm going to dump more insulin in here. Well, what if you start at 102 then, and that basal hike that you popped in isn't quite right? It's too much, but you didn't realize you needed the insulin before that. So
yeah, I well, probably it'll just end up being a different kind of an episode than I thought. But so where I go when I see somebody's graph for the first, listen, you show me a 24-hour graph, I can fix your blood sugar in about 4 hours. That's how it is, right? So, but the first thing I look at, if I see a graph that's kind of up and down, my first question is always, are you feeding insulin or stopping highs? Right? Mm-hmm. If you're feeding insulin, it makes me leap to your basal's too strong. If you're always stopping highs and everything's elevated, away from where I want it to be, and I'm thinking about 85 when I'm looking at it, then I think, okay, where we'll start is we're going to pick one basal rate.
Yep.
I'm going to bring everything down, try to get it flat, and then we'll identify spots on the graph where maybe you need less or more overnight or et cetera, that kind of a thing for basal. And then once I've got that, then we figure out the pre-bolus time, and I'm telling like, look, you have to pre-bolus. It's just not going to work otherwise. After you've got the pre-bolus time, then we work on understanding like the glycemic loads of different foods, and then you're kind of done. Like listen, we're stretching this podcast out.
It doesn't need to be rocket science.
Get your basal right, pre-bolus your meals, understand the impacts of foods, go live your life with diabetes, right? Like it kind of is like that. But it's fascinating to have that conversation, and just as well, having a conversation with a person and watching them have all their different aha moments, and they see all the things that they thought they were seeing that weren't right. And you're right. They never seem to be able to step back far enough away to see the whole picture. Right. It's really interesting. Okay. Do you do it similarly? You do it like
I do.
Well, though.
We do actually. I mean, you do it kind of really in the same scenario that we look for the lows. Mm-hmm. We always want to get rid of lows to begin with, because if you're constantly feeding extra insulin, you're creating a lot more of the roller up and down, because you're constantly adding, and then you might be correcting, and then it's dumping you off, and then you're feeding that and correct. It's just this never ending cycle. So we avoid the lows first, even if it means adjusting things to a little bit higher to begin with to get rid of the lows. Mm-hmm. And then we can bring that down. Once it's more stable, you can easily bring that down once you're not adding in all this extra food that you didn't really need.
Do you find that it's harder to talk people into believing that their basal is too low if they're experiencing lows? Yes. Like when you say to somebody, hey, your basal needs to be higher, they're like, no, I'm low all the time. Like, you're low all the time because your basal's too low. You're over bolusing for food and you're crashing after the food's out of your system. Right. And then they're gone. Then their minds are like, ugh. And I'm like, no, we're going to make the basal higher so that stable times are lower, so that meals aren't as impactful on your system. You'll see. And that's a hard thing to talk people into believing.
It is.
That's always interesting.
It kind of goes right along with, like, it's not really insulin deficit, but in a way it's sort of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Insulin in one place for insulin in another. One place is wrong, and the other one you're compensating and feeding with more insulin because the other place doesn't have enough of it. So if you get it smoothed out, then you got this nice, like,
right. Because when
equilibrium.
You do that, when you have it unbalanced like that, to me, the biggest problem it causes is extra bolus that's still available after food is digested.
Constantly.
Yeah. And then you're crashing, and then you're feeding you feed that insulin, and then you fly back up again, then you correct and crash. And it's just, it's fascinating to watch people. It makes me better at it to watch it go wrong for people, because the more that I can look at it and just say, like, oh, just do this, this, and this, it's great practice for me every time. Like my wife had said to me one time, she's like, the podcast reaches so many people at this point. She's like, why are you, like, you're giving a lot of time talking to like one person at a time. I'm like, no, I'm learning. Like, they're getting help. That's what they get. I'm like, but I'm getting better at it. Like, like by doing it.
You learn.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it is really interesting.
Yeah. I think it's the way that, and that's why I always bring up people's graphs when I'm talking them through adjustment, and why do I see the things the way that I am seeing them? Because going forward, I want you to have that tool. I mean, as much as I love all the people that I work with, I want you to be able to have these tools in your own toolbox and go on your merry way. And
Jenny can't sit in a pod in the Matrix and just with a thing plugged into her telling you all how to take care of your blood sugar for the rest of your life. So it's funny. Do you notice too that some people are just in general, so like, I don't know, I can never tell if they're scared or they're so sure that the things that they figured out are right. But I end up saying to people a lot of times privately, listen, I appreciate what you're thinking here. I was like, but you're just wrong, and you got to let it go, because you're fighting and you're wrong. I just try this once and see what happens, you know?
I think it's many of the people that I see that more so in are those that have some pretty significant like hypoanxiety. Mm-hmm. They're very, very, very worried about having a low, and many for good reason. They've had a very significant problematic event happen, or, you know, EMTs coming to their house, or, you know, being
that's a good reason to be scared.
Treated with, right. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to be scared. But I think I see that a lot more with that group of people with diabetes.
I'm talking about and I mean this with love, but the type A lunatics that are just trying to control like everything. And I'm like, you're trying to control 6 things you don't understand, which is you know who's particularly, and I mean this again with love, particularly bad at this? Nurses.
I'm not a nurse.
Well, nurses,
thank goodness.
Nurses who have kids with diabetes are particularly thrown by diabetes. It's really interesting. Like listen, had it happened once, twice, 3 times, I'd say, okay, maybe I'm making it up. I'm on my 300th nurse who all react exactly the same way. Like, I think that they're so accustomed to the order that they follow at the hospital, not really realizing that hospital order's just really in place so somebody doesn't drop dead or get too low. It's not really about managing diabetes day to day. But yeah, they're the hardest to break free. But once they break free, boom, then they've got it. Like, because then they can use that order that they're accustomed to in the right way. It's interesting.
Right.
It really is interesting how different people react differently. If you'd like to learn more about what Jenny does at Integrated Diabetes, go to integrateddiabetes.com. The podcast has a private Facebook group that you can find, on Facebook. It's called Juicebox Podcast, and then there's a colon, and then it's type 1 diabetes. There's also a public page called Bold with Insulin. I'm on Instagram, too. Just hit 10,000 followers there. That was kind of cool, because I'm not very good at Instagram. What a salesman I am. Hey, would you like to see an Instagram page that's probably not good? Go to Instagram. The Juicebox Podcast is sponsored by the Dexcom G6 continuous glucose monitor, and you can learn more at dexcom.com/juicebox. We're also sponsored by the Contour Next One blood glucose meter. Check it out at contournext.com/juicebox. Want to get a free, no obligation demo of the Omnipod tubeless insulin pump sent right to your home? You can do that at myomnipod.com/juicebox. Learn more about Gvoke HypoPen at gvokeglucagon.com/juicebox. Support my favorite type 1 diabetes organization at touchedbytype1.org and follow them on Instagram and Facebook. And if you'd like to support type 1 diabetes research that makes a real difference, check out t1dexchange.org/juicebox. Let me do a little bit of talking for the podcast itself here at the end. As the year winds to a close, there's one more episode left. But if you want those diabetes pro tip episodes, go to diabetesprotip.com or head back to episode 210 in your podcast player. That's where it starts. Diabetes Pro Tip, newly diagnosed or starting over. Don't miss the After Dark series. Any of the episodes that are titled After Dark and then something else, they're incredibly interesting and topics that people don't talk about very often. More recently, we have type 1s who've experienced heroin addiction, bulimia, depression, bipolar disorder, divorce. They talk about having sex with diabetes, smoking weed, drinking. Look for those episodes in your podcast player. They're After Dark, and then, other words. If you're interested in algorithm pumping, I have a whole series on it. Episode 227 is where it starts with Diabetes Concierge. From there, 252, 304, and then the great 3-parter, Fox in the Loop House. Episodes 312, 313, and 420 with Kenny Fox. We even have an episode about the MiniMed 670G. Jenny and I talk about that in episode 326. And the blog's pretty great too. You should check it out at juiceboxpodcast.com. Is there anything else? Oh. No, I don't want to tell you about that yet. How about this? Juiceboxdocs.com. Have a great endocrinologist or diabetes practitioner or need one? Juiceboxdocs.com. All right, that's it. One more episode left in 2020. It's kind of a relaxed conversation between Jenny and I. I started the year with Jenny. I wanted to end it with her. Without the talking over top of the ad music, you can see how incredibly repetitive it is. Isn't that weird? Look. But if you just talk over top of it, it's kind of handy. Learn more at myomnipod.com/juicebox. See? Then it really does a job. We're almost done now. You want to just chill with me? We'll do the end here. Change this here a little bit. That's how you can tell something's going to happen. I'll be back soon with another episode. Thanks so much for listening, for sharing the show, and for leaving great reviews wherever you listen. And if you're listening online, find yourself a nice podcast app and subscribe. The Juicebox Podcast is available everywhere you get your audio.